Okay, so our goal with this class is to talk about how to study the Bible. So instead of studying any particular book, we're looking at it at more of a meta level of like how do you look at the whole thing together. And last week we talked about the idea of rightly dividing the word, and that there is a sense in which you can quite literally do that. You can take the Bible and divide it into chunks, and that's a useful thing to do in just about any large thing that you desire to tackle anyways, right? If you have some very large project, it's daunting if you look at it and just say, I've got to do this whole thing. But if you can break it up into little pieces and just do a little bit at a time, then all of a sudden it becomes a doable thing. If you're going to build a house, you don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to build a house. You start with the foundation. Probably you break that down even more and say, okay, we start digging today. And every part of it gets broken into smaller pieces to make it doable. And the Bible's the same way. You break it into smaller pieces, and one, it makes it more manageable, and also it helps you to understand that there's a difference between those things. If you're building a house, there's a different technique to pouring concrete than there is putting in electrical. And so with the Bible, we have the Old and the New Testament, and primarily we want to understand the idea that with the Testament, you're talking about a law. And it's very similar to how we use the term a last will and testament, right? It's the last law that somebody lays down before they pass from this earth. These are my last wishes, the last thing I want to have happen. And so it's a law and a contract. The Old Testament was a law and a contract between God and the Jewish nation. And all the time that law existed, God was saying, but there is coming a time where I'm going to go beyond the Jewish nation. I will reach to the farthest ends of the earth. I will enfold all mankind. And the Jews didn't understand that, but interestingly enough, when in hindsight they could go back to the Old Testament, and you have places in the New Testament where that's exactly what they're doing. They're going back to the Old Testament and saying, oh, you see when God said this? We didn't understand it, but he was already telling us that there was going to come a time when we moved from a law for just us as a Jewish nation to a new law that is for all people. And that's what we call the New Testament. The Old Testament, bigger than the New Testament, more writing in it. As we break it down into smaller pieces, we then can go into the Old Testament and the New Testament and break them into chunks there. Because one of the problems with the Bible for you as a reader is you pick it up and you have a familiarity with picking up books. And typically you pick up a book, you go to the library, you pick it up, and the goal is I'm going to start on page 1, and I'm going to work my way to the last page, and when I'm done with that, I'll understand the book. If you attempt that with the Bible, you will start on page 1, and if you make it all the way to the last page, which is highly unlikely, if you've ever tried that, to just read it straight through, typically you find yourself hitting hiccup where you give up. But even if you do make it all the way through, I'm going to argue chances are you probably don't understand it any better than you did to start with. If you don't have an understanding that it's an anthology of books. It's 66 different books, and each of them has a different purpose and value to it. And so breaking those books into groups makes it easier. Now, before Gutenberg showed up, it was actually easier to do that because all of these books were in scrolls. And so if you had a copy of the Old Testament, which was pretty rare for an individual to have, it would have been very costly because it had to be hand copied by scribes. That's a job you find that shows up in the Old Testament. Scribes who tended to also really know the Bible well, because if you copy it by hand, you get pretty familiar with the thing. Every one of these books was its own scroll. In fact, there are some books of the Bible, like 1st and 2nd Samuel, that the reason that 1st and 2nd Samuel exist as 1st and 2nd Samuel is because to make it one scroll was too big. So they said, well, we got to split it. So this is 1 Samuel and this one's 2 Samuel, and it was just purely because to make it a single scroll, that's too long of a piece of paper, right? Because they're going to have to roll that whole thing up. So to understand the idea that these are different books was a lot easier when they were scrolls, because you'd open up a big trunk and there'd be all these scrolls in it, and you thought of all of this as the Word of God, but each of them is an individual piece. So we need to do the same thing, even though Gutenberg allowed us to put it like this, all in one nice, tidy volume. So in the Old Testament, the first 5 books are what is referred to as the law. These books are what's sometimes referred to as the Law of Moses. These are the books that Moses wrote from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy to give the Jewish nation its laws and inception. So Genesis covers where they came from. As you go through the book of Genesis, you're really looking at the history of how the Jewish nation began. We think of Genesis as our beginning, but technically speaking, it's the Jewish nation's beginning, because it starts with the beginning of human beings in the garden, but it ends, when you go all the way through Genesis, it ends with Joseph saving them in Egypt. Well, he doesn't save everybody in Egypt. Who gets saved in Egypt? By Joseph. The Jews, right? So it's about how did the Jewish nation make it to be a great and mighty people? Because the next book, Exodus, continues that story. And it tells you, well, that great and mighty people, they're in Egypt and they're enslaved. Well, that's not, they may be great, meaning there's many of them, but they haven't quite become mighty yet. So how do they go from great but not mighty to great and mighty? They exit Egypt. And God takes them into the wilderness, and God gives them His laws, and you can read those laws in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy before He takes them into the promised land. So those 5 books are considered the law, and in fact, all of the other books of the Old Testament, all they will ever do is tell Jews, go back and follow the law. Every single one of the prophets, every single one of the history books, all of them are just saying the same thing. Hey, that stuff that Moses told you, you haven't been doing it. Go back and do it. And so those first 5 books are the inception point for all the rest of the Old Testament. But again, it's a law for the Jewish nation. It's how the Jewish nation got here, and a law for it. The next set of books are the history books, and they do exactly what it sounds like. They take you through the history. So they start in Joshua, which is them conquering the land. They have the law, this new generation. They conquer the land, the promised land, and it takes you all the way through the judges and then the kings and the history of the nation and all the different things. Some of those history books cover things at a large scale. So when you're reading Kings, it covers things at a very big picture. You have a king, a guy who rules a nation, and he might get 3 verses. So-and-so was king, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Or more likely, so-and-so was king, and he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Very big picture stuff. But then there are some other books. For example, you take Esther, and this is a book that focuses on one individual and her journey and the things that she went through and how she was used by God to save the nation. So some of them are big picture history, some of them are small picture history. But those history books just simply are, and arguably they're the easiest ones to read because they feel the most like what you think of when you think of a book. We start here, it takes us through chronology, and we work to the end. The next set of books are sometimes referred to as the poetry books or the wisdom books. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Those books are figurative in language. They are based off of offering wisdom. They're not really couched within a certain time period. Now for example, with Ecclesiastes, you know that Solomon wrote it, so you can go back to the history books and read about Solomon that can give you some context. But you really don't need the time element to understand the wisdom books because they're timeless by their very nature. Wisdom itself is meant to be a timeless thing. And so those in their own way also become easier to read because they kind of stand alone. You don't need to have a ton of context to understand Ecclesiastes. It doesn't hurt. It can be helpful. Same with the Psalms. Psalms, it can be helpful to have that time context, but you don't need it. Now, after that, we have the major and the minor prophets. The difference between the major and the minor prophets is simply length of book. That's the only difference. Major prophets are not more important than minor prophets. They don't say things that matter more than the minor prophets. We get in our head sometimes major and minor, it's like better and worse, and that's not it at all. It's just simply size of the book. The minor prophets, of which there's a lot of them, they are there because they're shorter books. Now, there's one exception to that, and I'll mention it, which is the book of Lamentations is in the list of the major prophets. But if you look at Lamentations, it's a really tiny book. Well, how did a tiny book get in with the major prophets? Because the guy who wrote it is Jeremiah, and he's already one of the major prophets, so we just keep it with him. So, major prophets and minor prophets, and all of them, context of time matters immensely. Because as you're reading through each of those prophets, each of them, in fact, almost always, when you open up one of the prophets, it will start out by saying who the prophet is and who was king during the time in which they were prophesying. Well, that gives you the time context. So what you then have to do is you have to go back to the history books and look at the kings of that time, figure out what was going on in the world at that time, and that helps you to understand the major and the minor prophets. So major and minor prophets are some of the hardest books of the Old Testament because there's multiple layers here. You have to understand the history in order to understand the context to the prophets. And then, by the way, the prophets typically will speak in fairly figurative language, and they did that for a lot of different reasons. One of the reasons being if you were too blunt about it, you might get yourself killed. So they speak in more figurative language, and that's hard to understand. So you have multiple layers of difficulty, which is why when you get to the major and minor prophets, a lot of times people go, man, I've been a Christian 20 years and I have no idea what Isaiah is saying. I couldn't tell you anything about Amos. That's why, is because it's something that is a little bit more in depth to deal with. But that's how the Old Testament is broken down. The New Testament is similar, not the same, but similar. You start with 4 books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And those are called the Gospels. In fact, several of them start with saying the Gospel of Mark concerning Jesus Christ. It's the good news about Jesus. It's Jesus' life. A lot of people, in fact, they did a poll a while back where they asked people which books of the New Testament, what part of the New Testament did Jesus write? And people guessed all sorts of different things. But what's the right answer? Nothing. He wrote nothing. That's surprising to people. Because the whole New Testament is all about Jesus, but what part did he write? None of it. So the Gospels are where you will read about the life of Jesus. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they sync together. They're called the Synoptic Gospels because they sync. They synchronize. They have a lot of the same events, a lot of the same details. There's some different emphasis. Matthew, in particular, emphasizes sermons a lot. If you want to read the sermons of Jesus in the greatest amount of detail, Matthew's probably where you want to go. But Matthew's going to tell you very similar events in Jesus' life as Mark and Luke. Then you have John. John is the asynoptic gospel, meaning it does not sync up with the other ones. If you are looking for an event in Jesus' life, and you look over in Matthew and you don't find it, I'll give you a trick. Jump to John next. If in doubt, jump to John. And the reason is because if you didn't find it in Matthew, there's a pretty decent chance it's because it's in the one that's not like the other ones. It's over in John. Now, that won't work 100% of the time, but it'll work a pretty large percentage of the time. Because John, he wrote his gospel last, and it's as if he said, look, these 3 guys, they already covered all these details. I want to tell you the stuff that they didn't tell you. So, for example, John spends chapters, I mean chapters and chapters and chapters, on a moment-by-moment run-through of the crucifixion and the events leading up to it. Whereas the others will say Jesus went into the garden to pray, or Jesus took the Lord's Supper with his apostles. John will say, this is a prayer that he prayed with them, and he'll spend a chapter on that prayer. And then here was a conversation he had with them, and he'll spend a chapter on that conversation. So John covers stuff that the other guys simply don't cover. But all four of those are the Gospels. They are different perspectives on the life of Jesus, which leaves one book in all the New Testament as the history book, and that's the book of Acts. Acts is the single history book of the New Testament. It's one of the reasons that makes it so valuable. And for example, this year we're spending a whole semester on it. We spent one semester on the first half, and another semester on the second half, is because if you want the history of the New Testament church, you want to know what did Christianity look like after Jesus died on the cross, after he ascended into heaven. What did the church look like? What did they do? How did they worship? How did they live? There's one book to go to, and that's Acts. It tells you the history of the spread of the church. Now from there, the next set of books, Romans, all the way through 2 Thessalonians, they're going to be Paul's letters to churches. Okay? Now, Paul will, after that, have a few letters to individuals. But Paul's letters to churches are exactly that. Letters that he wrote to individual congregations, or sometimes groups of congregations. Galatians is to the churches of Galatia, so it's multiple congregations. If you really want to understand Paul's letters, Acts is where you are going to get the context of that. Because in the book of Acts, you see Paul's journey, and you see where he runs into these churches for the first time. And so understanding that context of Paul going to Thessalonica and what was going on in the churches at that time helps you to understand the letter. Then he has some letters to individuals. 1 and 2 Timothy, Titus, and Philemon are Paul's letters to individuals. 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus will sometimes, and you will hear me gag to say this out loud, pastoral epistles. I am telling you this not because I like that title. It is the wrong title. But because you will hear it, and if you ever read, and you read some book somewhere, and they say, well, in the pastoral epistles, I want you to know what it is, even though it's a bad title, and like I said, it kind of makes me gag. 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus are all written from Paul to preachers. Okay? Timothy and Titus are both men that preached. They are never once, ever, ever, ever referred to as pastors. But in today's modern religion, the preacher, what title do we give him so often? He's the pastor. Not a biblical title. As Phil pointed out, we don't even have the pastor. We have a group of pastors. That's the elders, the shepherds. But because of modern belief systems that have elevated the evangelist to the role of the pastor, Paul's letter to preachers, Timothy and Titus, are sometimes referred to as the pastoral epistles. I don't want you to get the habit of using that because you'll make me gag. But I want you to be aware of it in case you ever read a book and you wonder, what is he talking about? The last one there, Philemon, is a letter to an individual, not an evangelist, but Philemon is a letter that Paul wrote to a Christian that he knew, and it's about some events surrounding a man named Onesimus, who had run away. He was a runaway slave. He'd been Philemon's slave. He ran away, is converted, and Paul is helping them navigate the difficulties of that relationship. Okay, last. From there, those are all of Paul's letters, and the next thing is what are referred to as the general epistles or letters. General letters are literally all the other letters that are not Paul's. So you take Hebrews, James, 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Jude. All of these are letters that were written, but not by Paul. Or in the case of Hebrews, maybe not by Paul. because people don't know exactly who wrote Hebrews. Some people think it was Paul. Some people think it was somebody else. We're not going to debate it. But we lump it together in the general epistles, which leaves us with one book at the very end, the most famous of all famous books in the New Testament, Revelation, the book that everybody wants to start with, but is the last one you should start with. It's the prophecy book. Revelation is a prophecy given to the church about events that were coming soon, that they were going to face, particularly persecution at the hands of Rome. And the book of Revelation has a lot of prophetic, figurative language. Okay, any questions on that? That's a lot of me just like talking in one shot. We want to work our way through it. Anybody have any questions? Yeah. Yeah. This is a good point. Yes. Not in 2 Timothy. Yes. Yes. But you're right. In 1 Timothy and in Titus, it talks about the qualifications for pastors. And so in that sense, you can connect it. I'm still going to gag. I can't do it. I can't do it. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Thank you so much for the transition, Val, because these are the things I want you to remember about the Bible anthology. Number one, different books, different difficulty. Look, if you are handed a math book in the second grade, so you go to second grade, they hand you a math book, you expect everything in that math book to be second grade level math, right? You don't expect to be going through and you're covering addition and maybe 2-column subtraction or something like that, and then the next chapter is calculus and differential equations. It's not going to happen, right? Second grade math books have only second grade math. The Bible is not that way. The Bible has second grade math and calculus in it. And we sometimes do ourselves a disservice by thinking, here I am, I need to read all of it right in the beginning. And that comes from a really great place, right? I did the exact same thing. When I first became a Christian, I was like, I really need to read all of this and understand all of this. And so until I've read all of it and understand all of it, like I'm not even really a Christian. How can you be a Christian and not have read all of it? Well, look, I'm not telling you don't read it, but I'm telling you, look, if you are not ready for Revelation or the prophets, take a deep breath and move on to the stuff you are ready for, right? If you were learning math, we would not even attempt differential equations in the beginning. We're not even going to breathe that into the air, right? Can you imagine you have a second grader, they're learning basic arithmetic stuff, and some guy comes in and says, have they taught you about plotting statistics on graphs? He said, get out of here. Get out of here just messing with their heads. You're making life hard. Stop that. They need the basic stuff. We do ourselves a disservice sometimes by jumping into the deep end of the pool when we have not learned to doggy paddle yet. Yeah. And that's it. Correct. So, yeah, God tells us to study, show ourselves approved, pray for wisdom, and study. And because there's no private interpretation, that means there is a right answer, which makes it more like a math book, right? And what unfortunately oftentimes happens if people jump into the heavy, hard stuff before they've studied, right? Before they've gotten themselves to have that body of knowledge, the only way you can understand it is by trying to create some sort of personal interpretation. And that happens a lot, where people all of a sudden they go, I don't know what this means, but to me it just feels like, and they're winging it. That's what they're doing. You ever take a test in math and you didn't know the math, and so you just winged it? Yeah, that's what they're doing. essay answers were my friend. You just kind of write a whole bunch of stuff, and you hope that you wrote enough that the teacher is as confused as you are. People will do that with their Bible. They don't understand it. Yeah, Jeff? Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's exactly right. You are continually learning. You're continually growing. Some of the books are easier to dive into, especially in the beginning, right? If you read through John, there's an understandable narrative to that, right? Jesus shows up on the scene. You see him talking to people, performing miracles, teaching. He says things that are wildly deep, and that's where reading over and over and over again counts, right? You read John. I'm just finishing up a study of John right now, and I've read that book before, but still seeing stuff never saw before. It's wildly deep, but it's not difficult to understand what Jesus is saying. And so you have that element to it. When you're reading, the most important thing, in my view, is to read. So find sections of the Bible that you can understand and you're excited about, and start there. And, if you're in the New Testament, start with the easiest ones. Start with a gospel and start with Acts. And to Jeff's point, you're not going to understand everything, right? Because they're deep books. Jesus says things that are profound, but you can get it. If you jump right into Revelation, you oftentimes end up feeling like a failure, right? You read through it like you were saying, and you don't feel like you understand it any more now than when you started, right? We don't want you to feel like a failure. So the whole goal is start with things that are an appropriate level for your spiritual growth and work towards the other stuff. And what you will find is, as you do that, there will come a day in the process where you go, I think I kind of know the context here. I think I'm ready for Revelation, and you'll have a chance to take a class on it, and the other Bible knowledge has now built a foundation so where you're ready for it. Because Revelation, don't mistake me, is a wonderful book, and I love it. But it's not a foundation book. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, for example, in the Gospels, you get to Matthew chapter 24, and Jesus uses a lot of prophetic language in that chapter of Matthew. So as you go through Matthew overall is an easier to understand book, but you get Matthew 24, and you're gonna feel the brakes kick in your brain a little bit, unless you've got some of the tools there. So it doesn't just happen in Revelation. You're absolutely right, and it's about getting the building blocks squared away. We understand harder things in light of easier things, right? We learn the 2 + 2, And that then leads us eventually, because all of those skills lead to calculus. You don't start with calculus and then work your way back to basic arithmetic. Did you have a... Yep. Yes. That is a very normal feeling. You just have the guts to articulate what all of us have felt at some point in reading through that book. And so that's very, very normal. Okay, so yes. If I was talking to a new Christian, I would say start with a gospel. I recommend either Luke or John. John, because my reason is just this. John is beautiful. It's a beautiful book, and it tells you how Jesus, what he went through and his attitude towards us. So John, in that sense, is a great gospel, even though it's the one that doesn't sync with the others. Luke is a gospel Luke starts out by saying, I wanted to write this from beginning to end. It's the most chronological of all of the gospels. So depending on who I'm talking to, I either recommend Luke or John. And then after that, the next book I recommend is Acts. So pick, and so one of the other mistakes we make is, okay, I'm going to read all 4 of the Gospels, all in a row. You will notice when I put together our daily Bible reading program, I never put the Gospels all together because it will mess with your head. And it will also discourage you, right? You're like, imagine reading a book and then reading another book that's basically the same book right next to it. You feel like, I just already did this. So I don't recommend reading Matthew, then Mark, then Luke, then John. Pick one, then move to Acts. But yeah, I recommend Luke or John, and then Acts. Any other questions? Okay, so one, different books, different difficulties. In 2 Peter, Peter makes a comment that Paul wrote some things that are difficult to understand. So if an apostle says that another apostle wrote some stuff that's hard to understand, breathe a little easy when it's hard for you to understand. And then 1 Corinthians talks about there's meat and there is milk. And right, when you are growing, you don't start with the T-bone steak. You start with the milk. Second thing then, chronology isn't always the goal. Sometimes it is. Sometimes the goal is to go from beginning to end. Luke is that way. That's what Luke said. My goal is to write this book so that you understand from beginning to end the life of Jesus. John, on the other hand, he says, I wrote this that you might believe, which is he's emphasizing specific things in Jesus' life that would help you to believe that he's the Son of God. So different goals. So even as you're going through the Gospels, not even all the Gospels all cover things chronologically. So, you have to keep in mind, what's the goal of this book? One of the first questions that I'm going to ask before I start reading a book of the Bible is, what's the goal of this book? Next, book order and chapter verse divisions are man-made. I cannot emphasize this enough. Look, when we clump these books of the Bible together, they are clumped together the way we have because we said that's a good way to clump them together. But they each stand alone, and also with chapter and verse markings, people put those in. So when you're reading a letter from Paul, and it has chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, when Paul wrote it, it didn't have chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. Paul just wrote it. And so sometimes stuff from chapter 2 bleeds into chapter 3, because when you write a letter, you don't think, okay, well, this is a chapter marker. You just write a letter. And so you need to keep in mind that flow of it? What's the bigger context of things? So looking for that context, especially within letters, I think is really, really useful. Okay, there are different styles of literature in the Bible as well. And this is another element of learning to study your Bible means you're understanding, you're studying different kinds of writing. Likely, if you are a reader of any sort, you have types of writing you gravitate towards. And so if you were to go to the library and you're somebody who likes nonfiction books, you're going to gravitate towards that section. Maybe you really like poetry. There are people who just love reading poetry. You gravitate towards that section. Maybe you really like fiction. Maybe you like science fiction. Doesn't matter. All of these, whatever it is that you gravitate towards it because it's a certain type of literature that appeals to you. And all of us are that way. We have different types of things that are more appealing and make more sense to us. I have found in studying that there are certain types of literature within the Bible that I find more naturally appealing to me than others. Others I have to work harder for, but inevitably I find that if you have to work harder for it, typically the reward is a little bit greater because it's pushing you out of your natural comfort zone. One is law. That's one type of literature. And if you were to ask the average irreligious or only mildly religious person, they would probably tell you, well, that's the whole Bible. The whole Bible is just law. It's not. Law is laws from God for specific people. Now, those specific people might be everybody, right? A lot of New Testament laws, it's a law from God. Who's it for? Everybody. That's still a specific group. Specifically, everybody. Sometimes it's an actual individual. Abraham is told to sacrifice his son. Make sure that you understand that that was for Abraham. That is not for you. Your kids start looking at you weird, right? You have to differentiate between those two. So with law literature, you have to always ask yourself, who is this law for? That's like rule number one. Who is this law for? If it's for me, I need to apply it to me. If it's not for me, I need to not apply it to me. A classic example of this mistake is husbands and wives. You turn over in your Bible, particularly over Ephesians, and it talks about the way that husbands should behave and the way wives should behave. And when we're in a bad mood, what do we do in our marriages? Husbands grab the wife verses and they go, see? No, you stay away from those. You don't worry about the wife passages. You worry about the husband passages. And wives, you stay away from the husband passages. Those are for him. Who is this law for? And so you have to, even within books, pay attention to that sort of thing. Yes? Yeah. Yeah, so one aspect that can really help you with your Bible reading is understanding who was the original audience, right? So the original audience of Matthew were Jews. He starts out with a genealogy. I don't care about genealogy. Some of y'all might. Some of y'all might really enjoy genealogies. That is bedtime material for me, meaning I'll read it and fall asleep. So, but he wrote it because Jews cared a lot about that, and it mattered a ton, especially in reference to where the Messiah would come from. Luke, on the other hand, wrote to Gentiles. And so, very different audience, and that affects the way that the literature is written. Yeah. Okay. Second type is historical narrative. These are the ones that are chronological by and large. They are literal, and this is the part I want you to remember, they are without censorship. So when you go through and you read in Judges, or you read in Kings, or you read in 1st or 2nd Samuel about horrific things that people are doing or that are happening, do not cherry pick that out and say, see what an awful God who would have these things happen. They're history books. They're telling you what happened, not necessarily that God was okay with it. And we make that mistake, and it's one of the great criticisms of the Bible that that people who are critics of the Bible will throw out as slander is, look at all these things the Bible has. It has incest, it has rape, it has all these things. Yes, it does have those things because it tells you the history. And it's telling you people were really bad people sometimes. It does not mean God approves of that. Poetry and wisdom books, poetry books in particular, are highly emotional writing. And wisdom books often talk in generalization. Train up your child in the way that they should go, and when they are old, they will not depart from it. That is a general wisdom truth. Can you imagine doing the opposite, saying, I'll just let them do whatever. I'm not going to train them at all. It'll be fine. We all know how that turns out. Your kid's the one screaming and crying and throwing tantrums in the grocery store at 14. Right? So if you don't train up a child in the way they should go, you're definitely going to have problems. But are there cases where people have trained up their children in the way they should go and they do not obey the gospel? Yes. It is a general wisdom thing. In the same way, it talks about being a faithful steward, saving and investing. That the Proverbs talks a lot about money management and how you should be careful with it. And if you're careful with money, you'll end up with more money. That is generally true. But are there ever cases of people who were careful with money and invested in everything and then still ended up losing it all? Yeah. Okay, so we need to understand with wisdom books, they speak in generalizations. And generalizations are very important, but we need to understand they are still generalizations. Poetry is highly emotional. It tells you how somebody feels. It doesn't necessarily tell you what they did. David felt at times like God had completely forsaken him, and he would write that way in the poetry books. But had God forsaken David? No. But David felt that way, and it's useful to us to know that he felt that way. And then the last is prophecy books. These are warnings and promises from God to his people. They often contain symbolic and hyper-figurative language, especially in the case of some apocalyptic prophetic books, where it's very, very hyper-figurative, such as Revelation. You have beasts and things like that. So that's all I've got for you this morning. Anybody have any questions before we shut down? Okay, great.